Hey, so if you're new to the world of web applications, you might be wondering, what is a database and why do I need one? The main reason you need a database is because you need somewhere to store the information that your application will use. Imagine you had a property listing marketplace. You need a database to store all of the properties that you will show on your front end. Now, a web application is made up of three core elements, the first of which is the front end. This is everything you see, so essentially your web page. You then have an API layer, and this essentially just allows you to interact with your database. And then finally, as mentioned, you have your database, which stores all of the information that your application will use. The last two elements, the API layer and the database, make up what we term the backend. To put it in simple terms, a web application is actually a lot like a supermarket or a convenience store. In the analogy, our storefront acts as our web page, aka our front end, and our warehouse acts as our database, where we store our stock. Now, with no way to transfer stock from the warehouse to the storefront, the warehouse is basically redundant. The stock is useless. And that's where our shop assistants come in, aka our API layer. Here, the shop assistants transfer stock from the warehouse to the storefront so it can be used within the store. In a web application, it's very much the same thing. The API layer acts as a middleman between the front end and the database, retrieving data from the database and giving it to the front end for it to utilize. Now, a backend is just a fancy term for saying you have a database and you have some way to interact with that database, aka the API layer. When we say interacting with data, that means doing things like adding new records to the database, retrieving records from the database, or retrieving data, then manipulating it in some way before it's eventually passed to the front end for use. Maybe you have an entire date stored in your database, but you only want to display the year on the front end. Your API layer would retrieve the date from your database, extract just the year, and then return that to your front end. One way you can think of the API layer is the secretary of the database. Your front end says to the secretary, aka the API layer, I want a certain piece of data. The secretary, aka the API layer, then looks through the database to find the piece of data that you need, and then returns that piece of data to you. Depending on your needs, different backends will be best suited. For example, using something like Google Sheets would be best suited for a prototype, a product in its very early stages that is still testing many things. The reason for this is that it simply isn't built to be a production-ready backend for a web application. It's great at visualizing data in the form of a spreadsheet, but it doesn't have the key features you would need, such as user authentication, so you can restrict access to certain pieces of data, and having the ability to hold hundreds of thousands of records. There's certain hacky workarounds you can do to restrict who can access what data if you were using something like Google Sheets, but they're just that, they're hacky workarounds. And the same goes for something like Airtable. It's great at what it does. It's a fantastic data visualization tool, but it's not built to be a production-ready backend for the same reasons that we outlined for Google Sheets. When you want to build something that's scalable, so it can handle hundreds of thousands, if not millions of records, and can properly manage data security, then using tools specifically built to be production-ready backends is key. Now, in the context of low-code, no-code, all of the primary backend tools have both a database and an API layer, so you can fully interact with the data. So that was just a brief look into databases and how they fit into the broad structure of your backend. If you'd like to learn more, on the screen now is a link to a playlist that has different videos on how you can integrate various backends into your WeWeb projects. Until next time, I'll catch you in the next one.